McMaster University recognizes and acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories of the Misaga and Haudenosaunee nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Secondly, I want to welcome Ruth Ben-Ghiat here tonight and thank her for participating in this speaker series, The Resisting University in a Time of Tyranny, a series that is hosted with support from the Office of the Dean of the Humanities and the McMaster Center for the Scholarship in the Public Interest. These events, of course, are only made possible through the hard work and support of a number of people. And as such, I want to extend my deep appreciation to my wife, Rania Filippaco, my executive assistant, Christy Caricato, Collins and Anna, media consultant, and my student, of course, Dalton, my student assistant, Dalton Bath. Thirdly, I want to say something about the purpose of the series and then come back to why we invited Ruth this evening. This lecture series was founded on a commitment to reclaim higher education as the center of critique and public good, one that connects knowledge and power, scholarship and public life, and pedagogy and civic engagement. This is especially crucial given that we're living in an historical moment in which higher education is in the midst of an attack by varied forces of fascism, undergoing a crisis of meaning and legitimacy, and struggling to survive both as a crucial civic institution and as a democratic public sphere. We live in increasingly dangerous times, and it's important to remember that fascism doesn't begin with simply violence, police assaults, or mass killings, but with a language of dehumanization, bigotry, hatred, and censorship. Not only have we learned this from the rise of fascism in the 30s in Europe, and of course in the United States and elsewhere, the history of colonialism, but also in the current historical moment, a moment in which white supremacy is resurgent, to say the very least. As is well known, authoritarianism is spreading across the globe, consistently targeting undocumented immigrants, trans people, young people, and African Americans, among others. The language of the far right is a rhetoric of erasure and enacts violence through its weaponizing of history, education, and those whom it considers disposable. Under authoritarian regimes, books are banned, voting rights eviscerated, women's reproductive rights erased, and history is rewritten in the language of white nationalism and political and racial purity. Threats of cultural genocide are no longer limited to the past or to the dark fictions of George Orwell, Sinclair Lewis, Margaret Atwood, Ray Bradbury, Philip Roth, and others. This is more than the language of polarization or a strategic dog whistle. It's an overt discourse and theatrical performance in the service of white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and racist violence. A logic overlooked by the mainstream press and consistently dismissed or underemphasized by liberal pundits, scholars, and public intellectuals. If fascism begins with language, so does resistance. So does a resistance willing to challenge it. This is all the more reason for intellectuals and administrators in the university not to be silent in the face of the current fascist turn in the United States and elsewhere. It's all the more reason in the face of the spread of hatred, racism, misogyny, and deceit for the public to speak out and refuse to be silent. We need more examples of intellectuals and cultural workers in the academy and elsewhere who push at the frontiers of the ethical imagination, connect their work to major social issues, and take risks and challenge the destructive narratives that are seeping into the public realm and being normalized. We need intellectuals who, in the words of James Baldwin, are willing to disturb the peace, oppose racist, sexist, and neoliberal orthodoxy, and as border crossers, make their work more rigorous and accessible. We need intellectuals willing to combine intellectual complexity with clarity and accessibility and embrace the high-stakes investment in persuasion and cross-disciplinary borders in order to speak with what Rob Nixon calls the cunning of lightness and a methodological promiscuity that keeps language attuned to the pressing claims for justice. We have invited Professor Ben-Ghiat here tonight because she has struggled bravely and with great dignity for a number of years to remind us of what it means to be both a scholar and a public intellectual, what it means to take personal and professional risk in order to challenge the poisonous nature of authoritarianism, historical amnesia, white supremacy, and what it means to affirm the power of education as a central element of collective struggle in its attempts to enlighten the mind and create powerful social movements against a wide range of oppressions. She has held the flag of analysis high, while infusing her work with a passion and a sense of commitment. Her academic and public scholarship has made clear that authoritarian violence is as visceral as it is abstract and dangerous. As a scholar, she sets the research bar high and yet does it with grace, lucidity, and humility. As a public intellectual, she's a national treasure. She is an articulate spokesperson for moral witnessing, the power of remembrance, critical consciousness, and a collective resistance in the face of tyranny. Her work offers up a recuperating politics that displays historical, political, and social narratives wedded to the belief that the current regimes of tyranny can be resisted and human beings can be moved to imagine that alternative futures are as possible, and that acting on those beliefs is a crucial step in making fundamental change happen. Her work echoes the words of the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who bravely argued that freedom is an empty abstraction if people fail to act, and that if there is no struggle, quote, there is no progress. Let me cite a brief excerpt from her book, Strongmen, which captures a central element of the deeply informed and moving spirit of her politics and scholarship. She writes, there are two paths that people can take when faced with the proliferation of polarization and hatred in their societies. They can dig their trenches deeper, or they can reach across the lines to stop a new cycle of destruction, knowing that solidarity, love, and dialogue are what the strong man most fears. History shows the importance of keeping hope and faith in humanity and of supporting those who struggle for freedom in our time. We can carry with us the stories of those who lived and died over a century of democracy's destruction and resurrection. They are precious counsel for us today. Professor Ben-Ghiat's work is courageous and a noble invitation to read history against the politics and culture of fascism, white supremacy, misogyny, and violence, a treasure trove for witnessing the unsettling and the unspeakable, and a call to critically speak out and resist collectively the culture of visceral and symbolic violence. She is a professor of history and Italian studies at New York University. She's a scholar on fascism and authoritarian leaders, a cultural critic, and the author of numerous books, essays, and opinion pieces. She's a political commentator for CNN. Her most recent book, Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present. It's a pleasure to welcome Professor Ben-Ghiat.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Giroux. It's a lovely introduction. And thank you to everyone who is gathered here tonight. I'm going to talk about how authoritarians rule and how they can be defeated. So, and also what an anti-authoritarian future might look like. So it's no secret, and as Professor Giroux said, we're living through historic times when the global clash between democracy and autocracy is coming to a head. Authoritarianism is ascendant. Over 70% of the population of the world is now governed by variations on the system, some kind of illiberal system. And yet, the spread of illiberal rule has sparked an unprecedented wave of nonviolent resistance. And we don't hear about this described in a holistic manner, but we're actually witnessing the start of a kind of shift away from authoritarian practices of plunder and enslavement of minds and bodies. This shift is visible in the renaissance of protests, and I'll go into that later, the revival of unions and labor actions, and not just in the United States, and the move away from globalization and fossil fuels, this last accelerated by Russia's genocidal war on Ukraine. The dirty secret of authoritarianism is that it's unsustainable. Authoritarian states have long claimed they offer a more efficient model of governance than democracy. The whole BS about the trains running on time under Mussolini, that line of thought. Yet they bring ruin to societies. They are linked for profit motives to energy sources that accelerate the climate crisis. They plunder businesses. We don't hear enough about the plunder of businesses. and their corruption and repression waste human and other capital and forced millions into exile. At a time when we face climate, health, food, and other crises, the priority of authoritarian states is never public welfare, but always maintaining stability and keeping the leader in power. Those resisting around the world today know that strongmen leaders don't just endanger democracy, they pose an existential threat to humanity. And yet, hundreds of millions still embrace authoritarianism, its lies and its violence. So we need to understand why. And there are patterns, and that's one of the reasons I wrote Strongmen as a book that goes over 100 years to kind of look at what was recurring. So one factor that recurs, for 100 years, charismatic leaders have found favor at moments of uncertainty and transition, when traditional parties and political systems no longer seem to meet the needs of the moment. These strongmen figures often come from outside the political system. They create new movements and political alliances. They kind of rejigger politics, and they communicate with their followers in original ways. That's very important. Authoritarians also appeal when societies have made recent gains with gender, class, or racial emancipation and equity. So they soothe fears of the loss of male domination, threats to elite privilege, and the end of white Christian civilization. And across the century, certain categories of enemies recur: nomadic peoples, Jews and Muslims, LGBTQ communities, indigenous people, and more. Now, another pattern is that authoritarians get a boost from conservative elites, who are their most important promoters and collaborators. Afraid of losing privileges, these influential individuals bring the aspiring strongman into the political system, thinking they can control him. And we know how that works out every time, starting with Mussolini and Hitler. They strike what's called an authoritarian bargain with the leader: prosperity for them in return for loyalty and toleration of his violence and suspension of rights. Those who sign on, this is a depressing pattern, those who sign on tend to stick with the leader no matter what he does. We can think, for example, today, the Russian Orthodox Church's support of Putin and into and through his genocidal war, and the US Republican Party doubling down on support for Trump after his attempt to overthrow the government and harm one of their own, Mike Pence, the vice president. And that's very interesting authoritarian dynamic. They wanted to have Pence killed, and he doesn't speak out, and they didn't disavow Trump. So I'm going to show a PowerPoint because I'm going to go quickly through the tools of rule. And let's see, here we go. Just put this, start from the start. Great. Starting with propaganda. I'm going to go through propaganda, machismo, corruption, and violence. And these are the things that help these leaders to get to power and stay there. So here's a great quote by Goebbels: anything permissible which is successful. Propaganda is a set of communication strategies designed to discourage critical thinking and persuade people that reality is what the leader says it is. And having a direct communications channel to cement the leader-follower bond is key. And before I said that strongmen know how to communicate in original ways, and they consistently use the latest media technologies to seem godly and omnipresent. So here's Modi, who, when he ran for office in 2014, he used holograms so he could appear everywhere at the same time in up to 100 places. And you should check out Modi's Instagram. He's very skilled at Instagramming his life. But propaganda is also about changing the way people think and feel, the associations they make, and it works through repetition. So they're going to be trained to make those associations. Jews demonic, blacks dangerous, and so forth. Now, propaganda might seem to be all about noise, but silence is equally important. Strongmen disappear people, and they also disappear knowledge that conflicts with their ideologies and goals. And we see that today, and not only in the United States. Today's authoritarians ban books with LGBTQ themes. They suppress climate change science. And in the US, history of slavery, racial discrimination, and everywhere the history of indigenous peoples has been repressed. Machismo, with some choice quotes by Duterte, the Philippines, and Berlusconi. So the gender politics of authoritarianism rests on three pillars. Institutionalized misogyny, so you put women down. Second pillar, exalting hypermasculine and brutalist behavior, and you prop men up. And the third, suppression of other models of manhood and sexual identities. And that's where every single authoritarian regime has repressed gay people, gay and men and women. Now, here we have the example of the hypermasculinity, Putin on vacation in Siberia. This was part of a Kremlin photo shoot. And we have a rather grotesque image, which I really wanted to include in my book, Strongmen, but I wasn't able to get the rights. So Trump isn't going to show his own body. So he borrowed Sylvester Stallone's body in Rocky III, and this is his idealization of himself as a fighter. And so this is actually not a retweet, it's an original tweet. So somebody, either Trump or someone in his entourage, thought this was a good idea. And the reason I include a chapter on masculinity in Strongmen is that too often it's not taken seriously, because, you know, you could laugh at these can seem ridiculous, but it's actually deadly. And machismo is how they use machismo for political legitimacy. And the appeal of these leaders lies in their ability to get away with things that ordinary men cannot. And that's the link between that machismo and violence and corruption. And here's a classic quote about the operation of corruption. And in my work, I not only deal with financial corruption like kleptocracy, but also moral corruption. How do you get people to collude and conspire? So corruption depends on changes in moral codes and professional ethics. It's about getting people to accept things they previously thought were immoral or illegal. And strongmen, this is a point that we see repeatedly, they specialize in bringing the unthinkable into being. They are innovators in lying, in corruption, and in violence. And think about Trump and the big lie. He got tens of millions of people to believe he is still today that he won the election. And rulers who come into office with a criminal record, like Mussolini and Hitler, or under investigation, that's a classic. Regular politicians wouldn't want to run for office under investigation. For strongmen, it's like, yeah, of course I'm going to run for office while I'm under investigation. Netanyahu, Trump, Berlusconi, Putin, because the idea is to get into power and then shut down the investigation. And they know that making the government a refuge for criminals is who don't have to learn to be lawless. They're already corrupt. So all these people bring in criminals into government. And that's why, if we take the example of the GOP, as it morphs into an autocratic party, who is coming in? Anti-government extremists like the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys, fraudsters like George Santos, a serial fraudster, a pathological liar, people who participated in January 6th. All of these people are the new cadres, the new political elite, because you need people like that for autocracy. Okay, last tool, violence. That's a great quote by Putin. Can use blackmail, vodka, or the threat of murder to influence people. I would add the classic autocrat art of making an example where you actually murder people, as Putin is doing to all of his elites today. So for 100 years, the strongman has led people to think of harming others as justifiable, necessary, and even patriotic. And propaganda is used to get people to see others as existential threats. That's very important, so that violence is self-defense. And I was honored to testify for the January 6th committee, and I wrote a report, and it was about how Trump used his rallies from 2015 on to radicalize people and change the perception of violence. So that's very, very important. So the violence that the strongman unleashes is his reaction to fear. And here we have Lukashenko, when protesters were marching to his palace, and he got in a panic, and he put on body armor, he grabbed his rifle, and he hopped into a helicopter. And so fear is a big motivator for strongmen's activities. It's why they use blackmail and clientelism to draw people to them. It's why they throw on a cloak of masculine invincibility, and why they build palaces and bunkers to hide in when their mismanagement catches up with them. And the authoritarian playbook has no chapter on failure. And every leader who gets into trouble or declines due to his own bad judgment is surprised at his fate and blames everyone but himself. And so Putin is no example. And we have going on now a case of autocratic backfire, right? Where Putin was ripe for this kind of decision based on hubris and lack of objective input. And he'd been in power. He's been in power longer than Mussolini as long as Mussolini at this point. And he has this inner sanctum of sycophants, of people who only tell him what he wants to hear. And he was at a point, I think, that he saw that he was at his peak. And this is when strongmen act rashly. And they do something that political scientists call gambling for resurrection. They decide they need to secure their legacy in history, and they're going to do something grandiose. And so Putin, he invaded Ukraine without gaming out the sanctions with his economic advisors. And of course, famously, he did not consult his military command. And the whole war so far has been kind of drawn back the curtain for many people on the corruption and inefficiency and incompetence of autocracy. And the military, the supposedly fearsome Russian military, has been exposed as an institution that's rife with corruption. And so it should have been shut down long ago, in my opinion, but it has not gone as planned. So I just want to show you this. If you understand the patterns of autocrats, you can kind of see these things coming. And so I am not a career Russian specialist. Putin is in my book, and I teach Russia, but it's not my sole specialization. But yet I was able, right after the war started, days after the invasion, forecast that this was not going to go very well for Putin because of the spirit in which it was launched. And here we have, voting with their feet, hundreds of thousands. I think it's up to 400,000 young Russian men have fled Russia because they don't want to be cannon fodder with, terrible rations and worse uniforms and just picked off by snipers. And it's a real vote for, it's a show of the inefficiency of autocracy. So, strongmen like Putin, however, are doubling down now because they know their time is limited and their scams are being revealed. And think about what happened in China with the COVID lockdowns and how they had protests, the biggest ones since Tiananmen Square. And I see them as rapaciously clinging to power, trying to exploit and hoard everything because they are the old paradigm of leadership. And they must do their best to block a new one from emerging. But they will not succeed, and this is why. So we'll pass to the resistance that I see happening in the world. Everywhere we look, we see evidence of a new will to stand up for freedoms and rights and push back against oppression. We're living through an incredible renaissance of nonviolent protest that constitutes a systemic and global reaction to authoritarianism. Since 2019, a record year for nonviolent protest, when a country has a demonstration, it's often the largest it's had ever or for many decades. And this was the case in Chile. The 2019 protests were the biggest since the Pinochet dictatorship. It was true of the Women's March, we never talk about anymore, in the US in 2017, which was then surpassed by Black Lives Matter, which engaged about 20 million people. That was the largest in history yet again. Israel right now, largest protest in its history. China, largest protest since Tiananmen Square, and places that protest doesn't break out very often at this scale, like Iran. So by bringing many people together, mass protests enact another effective anti-authoritarian tool, bridge building. And bridge building includes reaching across divides created by disinformation and hatred to find some common ground and establish a dialogue. And this, again, can be done when people who were not previously active come to protest, and they, like it's going on in Israel, for example, people who usually don't protest are coming out. Same with Iran. But also can happen at the level of trying to forge a connection with a radicalized loved one. Seems like everyone in the US nowadays has some friend or relative who is lost to disinformation, and they're trying to figure out how to deal with them. I have my mother. My mother lives in England, and during the pandemic, she was radicalized by watching Russia Today, which she'd never watched before. And she became rabidly pro-Putin and anti-Biden, and she'd never talked about Putin before. And so this has been a challenge that's shared by many people. So we don't hear enough, just as we don't hear enough about protest described in this systematic way, we don't hear enough about the hundreds of networks and organizations working around the world to depolarize the populations and create points of contact among people of opposing political beliefs. And the other thing about bridge building is that it builds confidence that you can even have a dialogue, because in places where disinformation has really done its job, the idea that you could have a dialogue at all is people lose faith that that can happen. So in the US, some of these bridge building operations, they're at a local level. There's an organization called Braver Angels that hosts conversations between Republicans and Democrats. And then there's other organizations that are like create coalitions between conservatives and progressives, or internationally, like the East-West Center. I was just in Honolulu and I learned about their activities. Or an organization called More in Common, and they employ people who have worked in conflict zones. And so they're working on this. So there's many, many different approaches to this. And this is hard work. And to do it effectively, we have to accept some hard truths. Autocracy may be unsustainable, but democracy in its present form has proved unfulfilling to millions. And we have to talk about that. So now we're going to the reinventing democracy part of the talk. Around the world, millions of young people are embracing authoritarian parties and ideologies. There was a survey by Afrobarometer, which deals with African countries in 2021, a survey of 34 people between 18 and 25 in 34 African countries. They found that that cohort was less likely than their elders to consider democracy as their preferred form of government. And of course, in America, we had the success of Trump that woke many people up to how disillusioned with politics many people are, or susceptible to demagoguery. Everywhere, democracies, especially those where neoliberal practices hold sway, can generate loneliness, economic inequality, and disaffection with politics. And charismatic demagogues like Trump know how to exploit this, right? And so he addressed himself to the forgotten, and he told them he loved them. So to protect our freedoms long-term, it's not enough to turn back autocracy. Democracy protection has to be democracy reinvention, so that future generations will see the appeal and the value of open societies. And we've obviously been very complacent in that way. And this means being open to doing things in new ways and also studying what the adversary is doing well. Progressives might take a cue from the way that authoritarians use, they're able to build communities of belonging. Now, of course, they're building them often, the glue is hatred and exclusion, but people who are in those communities, they have structures and rituals that people really respond to. They also communicate in dynamic ways, and they use emotion very successfully. To bond with their followers. So yes, when Trump says he loves them, he actually despises them. But what could it be if people who really cared about the people they govern used emotion? And liberalism is about the politics of reason, less emotion. And I think maybe we're missing an opportunity there. So this slide is one of the examples of Erdogan, the Turkish despot. When he feels his power is threatened, or he's not where he'd like to be in some way, he engages in what I call strategic crime, or when he's actually repressing lots of people. So this is an Irish headline, which is so beautiful. Erdogan cries on national television as 6,000 are rounded up and arrested. And that's a great headline because it gives the context for it. Another superb communicator, unfortunately for democracy, is the neo-fascist Giorgia Meloni, who's a very intense communicator. She's young, she's in her 40s. She knows really well how to gaze at people, and she's very skilled in that way. There are also lessons for democratic decline in the debacles of the 2022 elections in Italy, in Israel, and in Hungary. And I study those. I have a newsletter, Lucid, where I've written essays on these things. The center left in all these three countries either failed to articulate a true progressive alternative, or timorously moved to the center, or refused to unite against the far right. That's what happened in Israel. Okay, so moving to the concluding part. The good news is that if you know where to look, there are seeds of a new anti-authoritarian order that have been planted. Around the world, people are charting new paths, breaking with tired conventions, incentivizing democracy, reinforcing values, and reimagining power in ways that challenge the strongman model. And in Turkey, I think I put this at the bottom, there we are. Turkish opposition leader Ekim Imamoglu, he ran successfully for mayor of Istanbul in 2019 on a radical love platform. And he didn't want to have rallies because he said they were about authoritarian dynamics. So he walked the streets of Istanbul and he hugged people. And he also sought out Erdogan's supporters and listened to them. And he didn't judge them, he listened to them. And he's the only man who could easily beat Erdogan in the upcoming presidential elections. So of course, Erdogan has sentenced him to several years in jail. And that's why he's not going to be the chosen presidential candidate of the six-party opposition, because Turkey has elections in May. So that's the despot, today's despot. It keeps elections going, but it games the system with stuff like this. If you have somebody very popular, you sentence them to jail and then you can't run. We also have the former, the New Zealand Prime Minister Ardern in 2019 she did something very revolutionary. She adopted the happiness index metric as a tool of budgetary planning. That includes societal outcomes of greater kindness and compassion, along with traditional measures of prosperity in drafting your budget. So those are some people who I'm looking at who are really trying to reimagine power and what values governance should privilege. We're also seeing the start of a move beyond neoliberalism, which has been a primary driver of extreme inequality, alienation, and the plunder of resources and suppression of labor rights. In the wake of the pandemic, economists and analysts like Rana Forhuhar and Diane Coyle and others are seeing a shift away from neoliberal policies toward economic ones that reinforce social justice and have and practices of solidarity and community, like having community input into economic policy. This also means support for trade and manufacturing policies sensitive to labor conditions, changes in supply chains, and this was also caused by COVID, by the pandemic, to support manufacturing and commerce closer to home. Other developments are playing out in national contexts. I'm very interested in the new constitution that the progressive government of President Gabriel Boric in Chile presented in September 2022. Chile still had, unbelievably, the same constitution that Augusto Pinochet had made during the dictatorship. And it had been amended several times, but it's still in force. And so Boric, who's only 36 years old, decided, and he's a leftist, his progressive center-left government decided to redraft the Constitution, and they came up with this visionary document that gives voice to social and economic justice priorities that are shared by progressives around the world. It mandates gender parity in government and private-public companies. It requires the government to intervene on climate crisis effects. It addresses economic inequality that had provoked these protests in 2019. Importantly, it defines Chile as a plurinational country to recognize the indigenous peoples who make up 11% of the population. And this was the first time that representatives of the Mapuche and other indigenous peoples were involved in drafting the Constitution. And it movingly provides rights to animals and rights to nature. Now, like all visionary things, or many of them, it was hated roundly by the majority. I see it as too new. So 62% of Chilean voters rejected it, and it's now being redrafted. And Boric, again, he's only 36, maybe he's 37 now. He had vowed in 2021, quote, "If Chile was the cradle of neoliberalism, it will also be its grave." Now, his approval rating isn't so great, and conservative elites are mobilizing against him. They see him as a threat. I don't know what his political future will be, but he has produced a blueprint with that constitution for an anti-authoritarian constitutional and legal order. Very important. Okay. So, my conclusion. This is a slightly bitter but interesting quote by an Italian who grew up under Mussolini and fought in the resistance. And every country gets the gangster it deserves. My background studying fascism led me to understand the danger our changing political environment represented for democracy. And more concretely, I saw Trump start with his rallies and his loyalty oaths in 2015, and I thought, uh-oh, this is way too familiar for my tastes. It was very frustrating to me how slowly the media and the public grasped the gravity of this situation. And yet, writing Strongmen, I saw that wherever autocrats have appeared, societies have struggled to recognize the danger in front of their eyes. Acknowledging that it can't happen here means giving up cherished notions about national identity. For example, that the Germans are the most cultured people. And it's incredible, like Germany was not just a world leader in science and engineering in the 1920s and early 30s. It was also graphic design, architecture, in so many metrics. So people said it can't happen here. In Chile, where one country after another around it in Latin America fell to far-right dictatorships, many of them with US support, the Chileans said, we're not going to do that. Our army is loyal to the Constitution. And then they fell as well. Or Canadian politics is too staid and stable to support a strongman figure. Or the US is a bastion of democracy and it can't possibly happen here. So when Trump ran for office, I saw there was a lack of knowledge about the authoritarian playbook and how it works today. So I put aside an academic book I was writing on World War II, and I decided to focus on civic education. And that's why I wrote Strongmen and started writing for CNN. I wanted to write for a place that would reach the general public rather than starting out in the New York Review of Books or the London Review of Books and places that, quote, intellectuals are supposed to write. And I now give hundreds of interviews every year on how authoritarianism works today and how democracy can be made more appealing and workable for future generations around the world. As the examples I've given show, we need to think outside the box and have the courage to break with convention, and also to see convention as informed by racial, class, and gender assumptions. And this starts by revising our ideal of leadership. Why don't we give the star treatment to effective democratic leaders that's now lavished on these strongman figures just because they pose without a shirt on? This is sorely needed to support other models of exercising authority and power. So, for example, here's Putin. He doses out his machismo. And when there were giant anti-Putin protests in 2019, he goes out with his biker friends. And nobody has a problem with this. This is part of his machismo people have accepted. And yet, why isn't this acceptable? When Prime Minister of Finland, who's in her 30s, Sanna Marin, she had just finished these very difficult accession talks for Finland to NATO, and she went partying with friends. Big problem, big international scandal. So why is this okay, Mr. Thug with his thugs, and this is not okay? So we must develop models of power that see care, collaboration, and compassion as strengths and not weaknesses. It will not be easy, but there's too much at risk for us not to try. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. That was wonderful. What I'd like to do is, while the questions come in, if it's okay with you, for the next, we have 15 minutes. I'd like to start off by asking a few questions, if I may, that hopefully build on your work and maybe extend in some way some of the concerns that you've raised. And I guess that one of the concerns is that, every historical era produces new political formations. And those political formations really have to be understood within the context of a rebranded emergence of fascism or extremism and so forth and so on. And it seems to me that the question of propaganda and the question of education have taken on a really more intense, to say the very least, and powerful role in producing fascist ideologies, fascist values, fascist conceptions of what is normalized and what isn't. And I'm sort of curious how you theorize that role of education in the 21st century and in terms of what we're seeing today compared to the historical work that you've done in the past.
Yeah, I think there are big continuities and a lot of leaders have always gone after education immediately. When Mussolini came into power in 1922, his first two things that he did, and this is anybody who still thinks he used to be a leftist like many years before he was a fascist. He privatized major industries in 1923 to please the conservative elites, Two, he reformed the education system. That was the first major thing he did. And we see this, why do you think Ron DeSantis, who's like, I call him the Florida fascist, is concentrating so much on education? It's because, this is why I'm talking about how we have to think about solving the crisis of democracy, not only now, but with an eye to making it appealing for people in the future. Because what the attacks on education are doing, and the banning of books, et cetera, around the world, are creating the conditions for new generations to want authoritarian and illiberal models of leadership and be attracted to those things. And also, in the very horrible case of America, the whole idea that the rationale for not teaching about slavery and the history of racial discrimination, numerous US states have these resolutions that says they don't want to teach anything that's going to cause people, quote, emotional distress. That emotional distress is your conscience. And so education is not just about creating silences, which is what I was talking about before, but it's about retraining your emotions. And there's a very concerted attempt to get people to lose their conscience, to not feel compassion for others, to feel that there's a rationale for persecution. So education is at the center of everything. And that's why it's one of the first signs that it's one of the first things to be targeted.
I'm trying to get my image back here, which is no, here we go. Sorry. My image is not coming up. I guess the question, yes, I think that's part of the question that I was concerned with. The other part, and we do have a question that's come in that I want to repeat. The other part is I'm not just simply concerned about the question of schooling, which is really where the focus tends to be, but also about C. Wright Mills's notion of or Stuart Hall's or a whole range of others who have talked about the education of the wider culture, the cultural apparatuses, and the role they play today, particularly in light of the social media, as really very the Murdoch Corporation. I mean, is powerful educational forces that in some way transcend and maybe more powerful than what we're seeing in the university. That's one question. The second question is, what is the role of intellectuals here? You had particularly in the academy, you had mentioned what your role is, and there's a lot of literature now emerging that's raising questions about where are they? In the light of this enormous fascist threat, they seem to have disappeared, with few exceptions, of course, whether we're talking about Angela Davis or Robin DiGiukelli or others. And then the third question, and we can break them down, and I'll repeat. One, and it comes from Andrea Wow, who says, she says, you mentioned that progressives might learn how fascist leaders tap into a longing for community. Can you speak more to what this progressive effective politics might look like?
Yeah. So first, I totally agree. I mean, what if you just look at the action of Rupert Murdoch's, Fox in the States and others, what the idea is to emotionally retrain the populace. And I use school as an example, but it's broader than that. So one of the scariest things going on is the reason that all over the world, the global right has obsessed with great replacement theory is not just because it's a race, it perpetuates racism. The real part of it is, the real point of it is that it creates a survivalist mentality in people. This is very important because polarization is one thing, but in polarization, you could in theory still agree to disagree. And you're way more distant than you used to be, but you may not see others as a political enemy, and it doesn't have to lead to violence. But Tucker Carlson, who has mentioned great replacement theory over 400 times on his show, because repetition. Great replacement theory is a survivalist ideology. it's not just me versus you, it's me or you, and only one of us can survive. And if you look back in history up through today, the times when you get people to have hate rhetoric passed to violent acts is when they believe that their existence is threatened. And so that's what this education through the media and social media can do. And that's the intent of some of it. And that's what Trump's rhetoric is all about. It's me or the abyss. That's what Putin, we're threatened, Russian identity is threatened, so we have to kill the Nazis on our border. So this kind of survivalism is a big part of education through social media in a demagogic way toward violence. So that's one thing. Where the intellectuals, I think that, as we know, there's a lot of conformism. It's also, I'm very privileged because I'm at a private university. My salary is not paid by public funds, and I'm tenured. We're going to see tenure taken away to make people vulnerable, because that's how regimes work. You find levers to pressure people. And so there's many people who are discouraged from speaking out in various professional / political ways. Also, there's now many more deterrents for people. I myself am on this professor watch list, which is growing very rapidly. It's funded by the Koch billionaires, and it's part of campus reform. And their reform is, of course, they'd like to get rid of all liberals and progressives. And they make a page for you if you piss them off. And at the bottom, the key, and they document it with you doing this or that. The bottom, they have a number, and the phone number is for people to call and try and get you fired. And so I think that, and also the threat of lawsuits, the threat of doxing, and today's autocrats use, the lawsuits and things to exhaust people financially and psychologically. And I think that many academics probably think it's not worth it to speak out. And that's what autocrats always want you to feel. And I think there are many ways to resist. And I would hope that there are more things going on behind the scenes than signing petitions, but that's, where are they? I'm not sure, but I can just talk about all the probable reasons that we're not seeing more of this. It's not for everyone. You get death threats, you get hate mail. Not everyone may have that temperament to want to expose themselves to that. And the last thing I'll say, which is actually really important, the academy does not value, there's a lot of noise about public humanities, but the academy does not value the kind of work that I'm doing, for example. It's not rewarded at your institution. It's not even encouraged. And so that's another reason that many people don't want to do it, I think.
No, I think that's a fabulous answer, and I think we don't want to underestimate the conditions that have been created in the last since the 1980s, actually, in which we're not just talking about the courage to simply speak to particular issues, but the conditions that really bear down on academics that make it very difficult. When 70% of academics in the United States are casualized.
It's very easy to be thought of as like, I put aside my academic book, and I did a trade book, and I'm on TV a lot because I see TV as a superb form of civic education. You reach a lot of people efficiently, and you teach them. And I get letters from people, emails saying, you've taught me what autocratic capture is or what propaganda does. But academics and academic institutions perhaps see that as extraneous or not serious, not rigorous. And so many people perhaps are dissuaded.
Yeah, when I was at Boston University, John Silber fired me and prevented me from getting tenure precisely because of that issue. There was another question that I want to ask that one of the few we have left that I think is important. Joseph Burke wants to know, he says, why is it so hard for societies today to identify central elements of fascism? Is it because fascism is considered to be a history rather than a dynamic political construct of the present?
That's a good question. That's why a lot of what I'm doing is trying to help people to see how things work today. When we think of fascism, even within fascism, we just think about Hitler, and Mussolini is not understood, and he's way more useful to understand how things work today, actually, because he was a prime minister in a democracy for 3 years. And he also had the king going, he had the Pope inside Italy, and he used electoral fraud on his way to becoming a dictator. It's very relevant for today. So I think that people, if there's not swastikas in formation or tanks like in military coups, they think that, and if there's not one-party states, they don't understand how things work today. And so it doesn't seem, there's no clear tipping point. When you have a coup, there's a clear tipping point. You go, as I say, you go to school in the morning. In a democracy, you come home and you're in a regime. But today, because people keep elections going, it's much harder to understand when the tipping point has been done. And if you're waiting around for the eclipse of a free press, total eclipse, or the disappearance of parties, you'll never get it, because that's not how it works in most places today. So that's why educating people that it's all a continuum today and allowing them to have a framework for evaluating these things is really important. It's also why, just to conclude, I didn't use the word fascism for a long time to refer to Trump, and that pissed some people off. They wanted me to be saying, yeah, he's a fascist. And he's like totally fascist in many ways. And the reason I could see he was is because I studied fascism. But I felt at the beginning it was counterproductive, because people didn't see what they thought of as fascism, and then they would just dismiss me. So now I'm using it for several people, because I think that we have made strides in people understanding how things work.
I'm thinking about Primo Levi, who said that every age has its own fascism, of course. And I say that because I think in light of your moving cautiously towards using the word, there are many historians, as you well know, and there are many theorists who simply inter fascism in history and seem to suggest that it's a totally historical issue that can't be repeated unless it's repeated in all of a kind of preciseness that makes that kind of analysis, makes them complicitous with fascism in my mind. And so that would be a serious concern for you. But the last question is this: you talk a lot about, and I completely agree with you, and I think a lot of people do, about the death of democracy, or at least its fragility, and the degree to which it's in an enormous amount of trouble. And you also talk about neoliberalism, which I've been writing about for about 20 years. And it seems to me that one of the great crimes that I see around democracy is that people equate capitalism and democracy. And I'm not sure it works anymore, because I think that capitalism is a crisis. And I think it's in a legitimacy crisis. And I think that one of the reasons that we have this ongoing upgraded fascism is that capitalism has now turned to no longer apologizing for itself and what it can do. It now turns to simply scapegoats to further, of course, the fascist plague. What is your sense of that?
Yeah, I think that's why I wanted to speak about, and this I have to do more research on, but it's very interesting to me that a variety of economists are seeing this revisions of capitalism, you might call it, to accommodate a kind of, like, whether it's called globalization or, a sense that plunder that's allowed by deregulation, neoliberal, can't continue. And that capitalism doesn't have to mean, it not only doesn't have to mean democracy, but as democracies turn authoritarian, what does that mean? That complicates things. And so we have to reform it in ways that, if we don't reform it, then we're not going to get fully out of the danger zone, because that's why it's important to highlight the role of conservative elites, of billionaires. You know, DeSantis has something like 40, last I checked, 43 billionaires, many of them neoliberal, backing him because he's into small government and libertarianism. And so if we don't correct that, then we're never going to get out of these structural problems that create the social and psychological circumstances for people to embrace demagogues.
Yeah, okay, that's great. Of course, my last point, and we don't have to deal with this now, is that, you know, I love your concern about the need for creating a new language. And I think that one of the things that I see missing in a lot of the language that is now emerging around the kinds of critiques that you and others are producing is the inability to talk about inequality and the spiritual equality. And as the condition for whether we want to talk about loneliness, or we want to talk about alienation, or social atomization, or Audrey's question about the lack of community. But I really do appreciate, and I think many people do, the incredible work that you are doing to sort of bring that to light. And that's not really a question for you, because our time is up. But I just wanted to bring that in as a side comment that suggests that more people should read you if they can. It's very important. And
thank you so much. And thank you for having me to speak,
it's a
and
pleasure.
for your questions.
Thank you, Ruth.
Okay. Good night, everyone.